All right, so I think we are live right now. We are here to talk about why isn't my nursing resume getting noticed? And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Fung. I am a registered nurse and I've been nursing for about 15 years now in a variety of different roles. I've worked at the bedside, I've worked in education, I've worked in leadership, and for the past 3 years, I've been working as a resume writer and career coach. And I am the owner of the RN Resume, so focused on nursing and careers and everything to do with careers and finding your dream job. And I have here with me Adam, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Adam. I'm a recruitment consultant for West Park Healthcare. I've been in healthcare recruitment specifically for about 5 years and recruitment as a whole for about 8. So I'm excited to join today's webinar.
Yeah, so I thought we could maybe start with talking about what exactly is a resume. Like, I think this is a really obvious question, but maybe we could just talk about from your perspective what a resume is and what the purpose of a resume is.
Yeah, for sure. So really what a resume is for is to highlight your skills and experience. You're going to be going up against hundreds of thousands of nurses trying to compete against one job. And the role of the resume is to make sure that that resume gets noticed. And in this webinar, we're going to try and help you get that job or get that role that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, a resume is really a marketing tool. So you're using it to market yourself, to make sure that you're just not just listing your qualifications, but really proving to the person reading it that you're the right person for the job. And I say all the time that as nurses, I never learned about writing resumes in nursing school. So I don't know about you guys, but I never learned about writing resumes or anything really career related in nursing school or on the job. It was only until I decided that I wanted to move jobs later on in my career that I realized there are strategies to this. And using the same resume for 20 years is probably not the best thing to do. And once in a while, you need to upgrade and see what is out there. And what has changed really in the last 20 years is the evolution of the applicant tracking system, or what we call the ATS. So these days, you not only have to pass through a computer system, but you have to pass through after that the person that's going to read it on the other side. And what I've heard from research and what I've seen is that typically a resume gets looked at for less than 10 seconds before someone decides if they're going to keep reading or they're going to put it down. And I'm sure, Adam, you're really busy with screening, hundreds or even thousands of resumes, and your time is at a premium. So it's really important just to make your resume easy to read and hit those keywords that you're looking for.
Exactly. And for myself, I typically take a quick glance and I can usually tell within the first 5 to 10 seconds that we'll be really proceeding with the resume or not, just based on the first couple of paragraphs that you have listed on your resume.
Wow, so you really validated what I'm saying. So you're saying that if someone doesn't have the most important qualifications listed right up top, that you may just end up putting the resume down after 10 seconds.
That's right. And it's not just for work experience, it's for your educational experience as well. A lot of people who have been applying, so I not only hire for bedside, but also hire for senior leadership roles as well. And they don't put their masters at the very top. You guys work hard for that, and it's at the very bottom. So if I'm screening 5, 10, 15 people a day, why am I going to spend the time going through a resume that's 10 pages long, 5 pages long in some cases? It's really important to have all the kind of moneymaker positions and the moneymaker certification and education right at that top.
Yeah, I totally agree, because it was actually not that long ago, maybe a week or two ago, that I had to tell someone who had an MBA and their bachelor's of nursing to list that right at the top. So right after their name, I said, you need to move your MBA from, it was literally at the end of their resume. You need to move that up top and center, because nobody's going to see that. And they didn't realize that was such a big deal. But when you're a recruiter and you're looking at so many resumes, it does, you're not going to be doing all that, right? You're not going to scan for every single word that you're looking for. And I kind of think of it as like, let's say you're running on a treadmill and you're like, you've got 10 seconds to look at something. That's the test that you have to take. So when I help people write resumes, I make sure that everything important is on the first page. So if for whatever reason someone decides to stop reading, that they'll actually, most of the information will be there that will say that you're the right person for the job.
And that's the thing too, as not a lot of people realize, but either if they're hiring managers in the hospitals or if they don't have a recruitment staff in the hospitals, they have multiple positions that they're hiring for. So you have to allocate specific amount of times per position that you're hiring for. So if it's not within that specific amount of time, most likely it'll get looked over and your resume could be perfectly qualified, but if you're not highlighting that initially, it's going to get overlooked, unfortunately.
Yeah, so maybe we can get into some of the most common mistakes on resumes because I think that's what everyone wants to know. We all are trying to do our very best, but again, without having that training or without having that experience, we're kind of just what I hear all the time is that nurses will say they apply to something and their resume just goes into a black hole. So they tell me that they've been rejected. And I say, can you explain a little more? What do you mean rejected? And they say, well, I just didn't hear anything. And I'm like, well, I guess that is a form of rejection, but maybe it just didn't even make it past the ATS or make it past whoever was reading it. So can you tell us what you think are the most common mistakes being made on resumes?
Yeah, so one of the major things is a lot of the times with West Park, we have a dedicated recruitment team. So we're not only reaching out to candidates for passive candidates, but we're having people apply. Sometimes people apply, it goes through an ATS system, and if it's not picking up certain keywords, you're not going to get selected. So the way that it comes through is each requisition is assigned to a recruiter. That recruiter is going to be looking through all the resumes that come through, and it's come through a max rank. So if there's like an ace, you get 100%, and you get sorted to the hiring manager, right? Sometimes your resume gets like a 60% grade, sometimes it gets a 30% grade. You'll still get sent through the hiring manager, but depending on the recruitment staff and how the model is in that specific hospital, you're going to essentially be just sent through the hiring manager, right? So at least you're going to hit their desk. And quite honestly, sometimes our clinical service managers are so busy or our directors are so busy, they may not necessarily have the time to review it. So really working with a recruiter is definitely a helpful tool to try and get your resume to that hiring manager because honestly, with the day-to-day and how busy healthcare is, that the hiring managers may necessarily not be available to review it, right? So that's why it's so important to highlight those skills, get that 100% rank, and then the hiring manager will be like, okay, this is somebody I want to go ahead and reach. So really kind of tailor your resume, take a look at it, make sure that you are including the certain keywords that are in the job description, or what we have is also called knockout questions. If they're not asking those questions to kind of get you, right? They're making sure that you're going to be the fit because we want to make sure that you do well in your next role. So it's just really, really important to kind of, if you have your master's and maybe you recently completed it, but your resume shows in progress, right? Then necessarily the ATS isn't going to recognize it because most of the time we're really looking for people who have that completed, right? So really make sure that your resume is updated, take a look at the job description and try to tailor it to that job posting.
Yeah, and I have to say on my end, the most common mistake I see in resumes is just that they're very long. They're very long, 4, even 5 pages. I try to make sure that whenever I help someone write a resume, it's no longer than 2 pages. Because I think that there's this perception in nursing that you have to include everything you've ever done. But really, I try to help people understand that the goal of the resume is not to get a job, which sounds very counterintuitive, but the goal of your resume is actually to get an interview. That is the goal of the resume. And from the interview, you can sell yourself in many different ways. It's a little bit easier presenting yourself in person than on a piece of paper where you literally have to make sure you check the boxes. So I think that's one of them. And then as you mentioned, Adam, just spelling mistakes and errors, it shows that you well, number one, just your written skills and maybe the fact that you rushed through it or you didn't really pay attention to what you're writing. So it shows lack of attention to detail. And I think just including a lot of extraneous information, like these days, you don't need to have an objective statement anymore. We all know your goal is to get the job. You don't need to include references because that's something that typically is asked for after the interview. I would say you don't need to go back more than 10 years if you've been working for a long time. Especially, if some of your older positions have nothing to do with the position you're going for anymore. And also, What I would recommend to all job seekers is this is what I do. I literally print out the job posting and I get a highlighter and I start highlighting those keywords. And I have to say that you have to be really obvious on your resume. So if the resume is saying you need to have 5 or more years experience in whatever area, write down on your resume, I have 10 years experience in, so that you're not making someone have to read through your whole resume to figure out if you have that experience. Or if they're looking for certain certifications, just put right up top that you have them and that they're current. So, and even in terms of skills, right? So not everybody, especially if you're not in healthcare, knows what, for example, what an emergency nurse does. So just listing out some of those hard skills, those clinical skills will be very important.
And just to kind of add to adding the skills, we're currently hiring for a interprofessional clinical educator lead, and I had somebody apply, but all that they had on the resume was occupational therapist for 10 years at XYZ. And then just from having that conversation with her, I reached out because she has a master's, so I'm like, that's a bonus. And then typically once you're with an organization for that long, just being in healthcare, I know, okay, this person would typically maybe take on a educator role or would take on a charge role at some point. But then she was like, well, I actually act as a lead for all of the clinical orientations. And that wasn't on her resume. So when we kind of have that conversation, I know it's like, okay, I feel good about submitting that candidate to this role because of her experience at XYZ. It may not necessarily get her that specific job, but
Mhm.
when we're working with our unit managers or our directors, we have certain positions upcoming. So the particular director I work with was like, okay, she may not be a good fit for here, but next quarter I have another educator role popping up. So keep in touch with her. So it's really just about getting your foot in the door by listing all your skills, your experiences, and even what you do on a day-to-day basis. So like Sarah said about not knowing what an emergency nurse does, I'm not a clinician. I've been in healthcare, so I know the terminologies and I know all that kind of stuff by now, but I definitely can't do blood. So I would not be able to be a nurse. So I don't know what you guys do on a day-to-day basis. So really kind of almost walking us through like what your day-to-day is when you get on the phone with a recruiter is definitely very helpful to kind of sell your profile to the unit manager or whoever the hiring manager is.
Yeah, I think it's good to have a mix of hard and soft skills. So soft skills would be things like good verbal and written communication skills or ability to develop relationships with patients. But then some of those hard skills, like you said, not everybody can start an IV, and we can't assume based on your resume whether you can or can't do certain things. So I think it's important to spell it out. I run into this all the time where, and probably you do too, where nurses have not updated their resume for a long time. And especially the example you just gave, you had to dig that information out of the person. Do you ever hear back from nurses why they don't include certain accomplishments or qualifications?
Yeah, they tend to feel that it's not relevant anymore. But all of the nursing skills are relevant because you're building those hard and soft skills as well. Like when you first start in nursing, you're definitely not going to be able to start an IV, or maybe your blood draws aren't going to be as proficient as they are now. So really kind of putting in that information, and specifically for international nurses, with the government trying to do the push through the CNO, it's really important that the international nurses, especially, are listing what they do from back home, right? Some hospitals still don't necessarily include it. We are different. We're not the case. We take all sort of experience. So it's really important that the nurses, particularly, I had one nurse who was a nurse back home in India, and she was like, well, it's just a general hospital. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? I don't live in India. Can you explain that to me? And then she was saying, it's like, well, I do medicine, then I go to the operating room, and then I do some labor and delivery. So it's like, to me, I'm like, okay, maybe I can maybe place her at a general medicine position or a complex continuing care. So really kind of highlighting those portions is really important to kind of spark that conversation, and also keeping your resume current and up to date. Some organizations like ours are doing passive sourcing. So we're reaching out to candidates who don't even know that they may want this position. I generate almost, I'd say 80 to 90% of my candidates, especially for senior level leadership roles that we were hiring for, based on reaching out and I'd say, hey, Sarah, we're hiring for XYZ position. This is why I wanted to reach out to you. Are you interested? Right? So really kind of listing everything on your resume may prompt me to go, hey, this is why I want to reach out to Sarah for this position. So super important to keep everything up to date and including your previous experience.
Yeah, I think it's a general rule of thumb that you should update your resume every 6 months. Like that's probably something you should just even put into your calendar so you can update any new certifications or any new courses that you've taken. If you've left or started a new job, you want to make sure you update that at the very least. And I think it's really important also to make sure that you keep it really current. So I hear all the time there's this confusion between a CV and a resume. So CV, the way I view it is it's your personal record of everything you've ever done from the beginning of your career. But when you're writing a resume, you only need to pull out the important parts. So CV is like your walk-in closet, all the clothes that you own. And a resume is like you've got a suitcase that you're going to pack for a trip, and you only want to bring what's relevant and what's going to make you look good, and you can only fit so much. So if you can kind of think of it that way, the resume is so just because something is not on a resume doesn't mean that you didn't do it. It's just not relevant at this point in time. And I think nurses sometimes have a hard time letting go of that, or just, really trying to be concise because of the way that we, I guess, learned how to write resumes. And just going back to what you said, Adam, I think there's this tendency for nurses and maybe women in general to downplay our accomplishments. So, like, oh, I only worked in a general hospital, or in one case, I was helping a PSW who was studying to be a nurse help her write her resume, and she didn't even include the fact that she was a physician back home. So I was like, that's a big accomplishment. You should include that because that just added 10 years to your work history. Whereas if you didn't have that, you would be just listing your PSW jobs in a nursing home. And I think that would definitely set you apart.
Yeah, definitely. Then that's for sure too. Like I've had, so we have some mid manager roles, and then we have some director roles. I've had lots of nurses who have their masters who have had already been in that manager role before, kind of be hesitant of applying for that director role. So when I have these conversations with these nurses who are looking to make a switch in their careers, specifically women, they're just like, well, I wasn't too sure about this position because I've only been doing this, right? And then in my head, I'm just like, well, this is specifically what we're looking for as somebody who has those, couple of years of experience that are looking to make that jump. So definitely don't be afraid to apply for that position, but make sure that your experience is relevant and it's listed on the resume too. That really helps have that conversation.
Okay, and what would you say to someone who says that they don't want to apply to a job unless they meet all of the qualifications?
So people don't realize that hiring managers are a lot more flexible than they are. Yes, there's certain roles that are very, very specific, like labor and delivery, right? Like your background, Sarah. And then also in the ICU and in some of our leadership positions, it's very, very specific. But then if you have a couple of, so like we have a clinical nurse specialist that they're a little bit flexible on um, some of the must-haves. It's found out with our meetings with the unit managers that some of the must-haves are really nice to haves. And then it's just kind of having that conversation. And then if people aren't ready to make that flip just yet, then it's okay. We can always keep in touch for maybe a more applicable role for them in the future. But it's always worth just to kind of have that application and just apply for that job. What's the worst that can happen is have a no, and then you already have an in with whatever organization that you're looking to apply for.
Yeah, and I have a lot of new grads come to me and say that they don't know if they should apply to something because they don't have any experience. But then sometimes they haven't listed all of their clinical rotations or the skills they learned in their clinical rotations. So, do you have any advice for someone who doesn't have that much working experience yet?
Yeah, so definitely list all of your placements, including your consolidation. A lot of the times, if you have a really strong consolidation that you're applying for example, if you want to get into acute care, but maybe you have had medicine experience, having your consolidation in medicine pairing with another medicine placement gives you a good chance to get into telemetry. It may not be your exact ideal situation, but it's a step into your right direction, right?
Hmm.
maybe you haven't had any experience in medicine, but you're interested in getting into there. Complex continuing care is a great stepping stool for that as well. And that's a lot of the times, a lot of the placements that I do see. So listing your consolidation, the hospitals do put a little bit more stock into that than just your placements. So listing exactly what you do on a day-to-day basis, the skills that you've developed. Your first placement, you're going to develop a little bit of skills, right? But then it's really your third and then your consolidations where you really kind of hone your nursing skills and listing all those skills that you developed. Even if your first placement is, okay, I learned how to document in Epic, right? That's
Mhm.
still a big skill to have because a lot of providers and a lot of hospitals are still on the paper-based systems. So when they're switching over to the electronic functions, it's going to be a big knowledge because then it's going to help alleviate some nerves from the new nurses because they're like, okay, I'm familiar with even point click care, right? I'm familiar with how to use these systems, and sometimes just navigating that is part of the battle.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really good advice. And there's been a lot of talk about internationally educated nurses. They're being fast tracked right now because of the nursing shortage. And I know a lot of internationally educated nurses are struggling right now. And part of it is because they don't have the experience that you might be looking for. So, what would your advice be to someone who really wants to? I mean, they've been a nurse for a number of years back home, but they're really trying to break into the Canadian market. Like, what kinds of things can they do on their resume?
Yeah, so some of the biggest things that you could do is list your clinical skills, especially for some of the more specialized units that we have. A lot of people, surprisingly, that use ventilators don't put it on their resume. A lot of people that do tracheostomies don't put it on their resume. So something that's as simple as a nursing skill that people do day to day is like, I recruit day to days, but maybe people might think that doing a phone screen is nothing, right? And so you guys doing your IV insertions, you're doing your tracheostomies, your ventilations, you're going to be like, oh, well, it's a nursing task, right?
Mhm.
Well, it is, but it's important to list that, especially for if there's a unit like our ventilation units, right? We really need to have that skill on there. So if an international nurse lists ventilation, but maybe doesn't list anything on their resume as to like what units they worked in, we know that there could be a potential match there because the nurse has ventilation, tracheostomies, wound care experience, right?
Mhm.
So just kind of listing those basic things, you would think that may not necessarily be a good fit on your resume or may take up some more space on your resume. But for those who are not a clinician, it's definitely a big thing to kind of pair. So if I'm looking at, we have intake meetings with our hiring managers, right? So we're asking our hiring managers, what do you want to have in this candidate? If somebody says tracheostomies, ventilations, wound care, if somebody lists that on the resume, that's a good chance that I'm going to put that person forward with the hiring manager to get them in front of them, right? So it's just really, really important to list your skills, number one. And then two, it's like, well, it was just the experience from back home. It's just like, well, it would be like if somebody was to move from Canada to another place in the world and then just say, well, it was just my experience from Canada. That doesn't, that logic doesn't kind of make sense. So any experience is valid experience, whether the hospitals kind of evaluate that or not. They could still speak to that in the hiring manager interview. And in that way, you're a clinician speaking to a clinician, right?
Mhm.
So as long as you can actively speak to how to maybe manage somebody's diabetes levels or manage how to treat a pressure wound, right? That's really all that the hiring managers are looking at. They're not necessarily going to care that your international experience was from 5 years ago because it took 4.5 to get all your CNO and everything processed, right?
Mhm.
So it's just really important to kind of list those skills on there. And then the hiring managers and the unit managers are going to be the ones that are going to determine, along with behavioral and scenario based questions, whatever your scoring guide is, just to kind of make sure that we have that the general kind of need on that piece, right?
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think for nurses, we need to really eliminate two words from our vocabulary, and that's just and only. Because I've worked with a number of clients who, like I said, they downplay their accomplishments. So I was working with someone who said, "Oh, I don't know if I should list the fact that I was a prison nurse because it was only for 8 months." And I'm like, "You were a prison nurse? That's amazing! Like it is really hard work. You're dealing with violence. You're dealing with mental health disorders. You're dealing with all kinds of things." And she said, "Well, it was only 8 months." I'm like, "Yes, but this is something that not everybody has. And you actually have a lot of skills that not other people, like other people don't have." So I think people just really think about when you say I only or I just have something, it's like, but you might have something that not everybody else has. And the fact is, the human body is the same no matter where you go in the world. So, yes, hospital settings might be different, policies might be different, individual practices might vary, but when you're a nurse, there are a certain basic set of skills that you do have, and you just need to make sure you sell yourself with those skills. Um, One thing I did want to ask you, Adam, is I get a question sometimes about there being a gap on a resume. So, like, at what point is a gap a red flag, or is there anything that someone can do to address that gap in work history?
Yeah, so gaps aren't necessarily red flags. It's not a great thing to have on the resume, but if you're talking to a recruiter who truly knows the role and knows how to dig into those informations, there's ways where we can speak to hiring managers to address those gaps, right? We're not kind of in like 1990 anymore, where the gap was like a mega break for a certain position or anything like that. It's just truly important that we address the gap, right? If there's like personal situations or if there was like a death in the family, we're obviously not going to disclose that personal information to our hiring managers. We would just say, hey, there was a personal situation that resulted in this nurse not being working from this time to this time, right? But now they're ready to re-enter the workforce, and this is what they're looking for. So there's certain ways where we can disclose that gap and address it without necessarily disclosing your personal situation wherever you in. Because sometimes I've had some nurses who moved from back home to here in Canada, and then that 5 year gap was literally just them trying to get all the ducks in a row, all the required documents, because with all the backlogs and everything like that, and then starting a family, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not a red flag. Yes, sometimes it gets a little bit of a red flag with there's a contract job, and you weren't keeping that contract job. But then in that case, what you would need to do is just need to justify why you weren't staying with that organization, because typically there's a lot of internal needs once you're with an organization. So it's just like, okay, well, why didn't you apply for a permanent part-time, or why didn't you apply for a permanent full-time, right? So you just kind of really need to justify why you weren't necessarily moving forward with that organization. And if you didn't like the organization, that's not a red flag, right? You got to find a lot of people don't necessarily talk about the wants and needs of the nurse or the candidate, because it's just like, oh, well, hospitals are experiencing shortages or anything like that, right? Yes, we have a need, but we also want to make sure that this is going to fulfill your goals and your expectations in this role, because otherwise the turnover is just going to keep on happening. So just the biggest thing is just be honest with your recruiter or human resources what your gaps were. And there's going to be specific ways where we could address that with the hiring manager without disclosing your personal situations or your information.
Mhm. Yeah, I think career breaks now are becoming a bit more normalized because I noticed on LinkedIn actually there's a new feature where when you go to your work history, you can put career break. And I think it's just trying to normalize the fact that life happens. Like you said, you might be starting a family, you might have to look after an ill family member, you might have moved locations. There's many different reasons that are justifiable as to why you don't have a completely solid work history. And so I guess like up until now, we've talked a lot about the content of a resume. I feel like resume writing is content, a little bit of layout too. So I wanted to talk about my suggestions, and then maybe you could go into what your suggestions are for ease of reading in terms of layout. So I've mentioned already that your resume should be anywhere between 1 to 2 pages, no longer than that. you really want to use a font size that's big enough for the person who's reading it on the other end. So I would say at least a size 11 to 12. If you think about, I want to say older eyes, sometimes it's hard to read smaller font, and you want to do everything you can to make it easy for the person on the other end to pick out information. So for that reason, I always recommend listing information in bullet points rather than paragraphs, because sometimes I'll get a resume that's just like a wall of text and I can't even discern one thing from another. So just really having a balance of text, but also a little bit of white space. I know recruiters really like to see your jobs in reverse chronological order. So meaning the most recent to the least recent, rather than doing things like a functional based resume, which would be just kind of listing your skills versus listing the order in which you've had your jobs. Also, you want to make sure that your headings are nice and big so that your name is right up front and center. You no longer need to include things like your address. So for privacy reasons, don't include your address anymore, just the city or province and state that you're currently in, your phone number, and your email address. And you might also want to list, you might want to put a link to your LinkedIn profile if it's updated. That way, if there is extra information, let's say, that doesn't fit on your 2-page resume, your LinkedIn profile can really be as long as you want. There's a lot of collapsible different sections, so you can list a lot of things. And also on LinkedIn, there's a skills section, so you can actually list all the different skills that you have. So if a recruiter was, let's say, looking for someone who had experience with wound care, if you've listed it in your skills section, it makes it a little bit easier for someone to find you for those particular skills.
Yeah, and the big thing too with keeping your LinkedIn resume up to date and your skills up to date and everything like that too, recruiters use something called a Boolean search string. And what that is there's different operators where I could say, I want to search for a registered nurse in Toronto, Ontario, and I want to have them have, I want them to have certain certifications, right? And there's different ways where we can essentially pull different parts of the LinkedIn profile, right? So we could pull job title, we could pull headline. So if you're a registered nurse with your, and maybe you're a wound care nurse and you have your NSWOC, right? You could put registered nurse, RN, NSWOC, and then that will pull. And then maybe you didn't know that there was a role that I'm hiring for that you're really interested in. Maybe you just got that certificate, right? And with that, I could go and I could be like, hey, Sarah, I reached out to you because I reviewed your profile and you have this and this and this. Are you open to anything, right? So that's really important to have that, because a lot of the hospitals are going towards the passive candidate sourcing. So if your resume just has registered nurse and Toronto, we don't know necessarily what we don't know necessarily what you're looking for, or even if you're looking. And there's different options that you could put on your profile that you're open to work, right? So if I send a nurse saying that, hey, I'm open to work, and then I send them a role about bedside, but then the nurse is like, hey, I'm really looking for a leadership opportunity, and then they decline my invite, it's like, well, I do have leadership opportunities. So then that way it could be like open to, and then it's like clinical nurse educator roles. I'm open to manager roles. So really utilizing the LinkedIn features is very important as well. And having that open to work symbol is not necessarily a bad thing. Nurses have a lot of opportunities right now, and you might as well capitalize on those opportunities while they're available. And your organization is not going to be necessarily punishing you for having that filter on your profile. Just because you're open to work doesn't mean you're going to make a switch tomorrow.
Right, right. And if you guys haven't heard that, Adam and I actually did a separate webinar on how LinkedIn can be the best thing for your career, which is actually on my YouTube channel. So if you guys go to YouTube and just look up the RN resume, you'll be able to find mine and Adam's full hour talk on LinkedIn and how great it is and all the different things you can do. We have a question from someone named Marie, and she's asking, how do you manage career shifts? For instance, from IT background to clinical and wanting to be in nursing informatics. She's currently in a master's degree program. She says she has 20 years IT experience and 5 years RN experience. So what I can say, I've been helping a lot of nurses find remote work, and I think it's just switching the focus of your resume. So again, going back to tailoring your resume to the job posting, they're going to be asking for things like, can you use Microsoft Office? Can you, can you do video conferencing? Can you work well independently? Are you able to manage multiple priorities? And so really addressing those qualifications, I think, is important. So switching your focus of your resume from clinical skills like those IVs, blood starts, wound care, ventilator, and switching it to the technical skills that they're looking for. And even listing all of the different electronic charting systems you've used can show that you are computer savvy. So there's different things that you can do. And if you're currently in your master's program, you might want to include that on your resume. So you could say the name of the program and then in brackets in progress, and then maybe even list the expected graduation date so that people know whether it's 1 year or 3 years away. It does make a difference in terms of if they would consider you for that role or not.
Yeah, and I could speak to that as well. We do have a few roles at the moment that do require a master's, and I submitted 2 candidates. One of the candidates, she just started her master's, and there was another candidate who was about 6 months away. So the hiring manager went with the candidate that was 6 months away, and then she wanted to keep in touch with our new smart hospital that's being built shortly. She says that there will be a need for that candidate as well. But she was more eager to interview the one that it had the 6 months left on her master's. And then there could be different clauses put in an offer letter and stuff like that. So don't be afraid to still apply for that job if you haven't completed your master's yet.
Yeah, and I think in your case, Marie, it would be good to mention the fact that you've had this unique combination of experience because there aren't very many nurses, to be honest, who have been working 5 years but have that 20 years IT experience. So it's good to list some of those older skills as well. And this is one case where I think it might be helpful to go farther back than 10 years because you do have some work history that would be relevant to the current job that you want to apply to. So we're open to any other questions. If anyone wants to type it in the chat, it's the only way right now we can see any questions. Just because it's my first time, Adam's first time doing a LinkedIn Live. We're trying to figure out the tech kinks. But Adam, was there anything else related to resumes that you wanted to go over?
Nothing in particular. Just maybe some of the resume don'ts that that I've kind of seen come across my desk. So don't include your street address. That can not necessarily have discrimination, but if people are familiar with a certain area, they might not necessarily consider from a certain location. I have had that experience before as well with some of the hiring managers, not necessarily in my current role, but with some of the hiring managers are like, oh, that location is pretty rough. I haven't had great experiences over there. So they may have certain negative connotations from that location. So like Sarah said, just kind of keep it to the address. And typically, depending on the role, the recruiter will always verify, even if it's not necessarily a community nursing job where you're going to be going from home to home, but even to make sure that the location is going to work for you, because nobody wants to drive an hour, 2 hours for work. So we like to confirm and just be like, hey, are you familiar with where organization XYZ is? So I always say with West Park, hey, where is this is our closest intersection. How do you feel about that commute, right? Because people in the summertime, if they're applying, they forget with our Canadian winters, it starts to get a little bit daunting on that one. When it comes to other situations, a lot of times with international applications, people include their profile picture, they include their age, their marital status, their citizenship eligibility. That is not anything that I need to know or my hiring manager will need to know. All that we really need to know is your clinical skills, your experience, and kind of like what you're looking for. So it's very, very important that you don't list too much personal information because there is a lot of fraud out there, including employment fraud as well. You'll have some people trying to prey on your personal information, and you don't want to give any more than you need to. Sarah, are you okay if I kind of keep on going?
Yes, keep going. Yeah, if you got more to say.
Information from high school, even if somebody is a valedictorian or they're on the honor roll, it's good information, good traits to have, but we don't necessarily need to know that if it's maybe 15, 20 years ago. Really list your relevant skills and experiences. Small fonts for those who wear glasses or just we're looking at computer screens all day. So that's really important to have a regular size font, like Sarah alluded to. Another thing that is kind of gone in the way of the dodo bird is objectives or references. Like Sarah said, the references are going to be addressed in the HR portion of the onboarding process. So the recruiter doesn't need to call them up front. And then just saving the document as resume. What also really helps is making sure that you are targeting in your resume file. It's like for myself, if I were to be looking for a switch internally in my organization, I would be saying, hey, I'm looking for a recruitment manager position. I would say Adam Penny, recruitment manager doc or PDF. So really kind of tailoring, and then that way it's like, oh, this person really saw it. Even sometimes including the competition number too, because not a lot of people pay attention. They're just applying, right? So the more attention to detail that you could give your application, the bigger of a chance that even if you don't necessarily get selected for the role, that recruiter can kind of keep in their back pocket for an opportunity in the future. So just kind of putting that type of attention to your application is a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about saving the document is so true, because if you save it as resume, there's going to be 200 people with resume. And if that hiring manager can't find it, they might forget, and then you won't get a call. So I think another really important thing is the name that you list on your resume and your email address ideally should be the same name, because sometimes even with my own clients, I get confused because I had a client recently who had a different first and last name on her resume than in her email address. And because it was her maiden name and she went by a short form, I was like, I think you just need to standardize it. Like, it doesn't matter what name you pick, just make it the same, because it becomes very confusing. And then with her email, when she emailed me, it was a third different name. So I was actually losing track. So just little things to make it as easy as possible for the person to contact you and kind of like put a name to the resume is really important. We have a couple questions in the chat. So the first one.
Sorry, Sarah. Can I just add something
Yes,
to your
yes.
point there?
Yeah.
Keeping the name the same that you have registered with in the CNO.
Oh,
Because
yes.
a lot of the times when we're submitting candidates to our unit managers or our hiring managers, they want to really make sure that they're entitled to practice in Ontario. So we really want to make sure that we include that registration. And my dog wants to join the webinar. So we really want to make sure that you're going to be entitled to practice, right? Because maybe you're not set to write your NCLEX exam for a couple more weeks, right? We can include that and we can flag that in advance.
That's really good information, because there are a lot of people that go by different names. Like if you've just gotten married, maybe you switched your name socially, but you haven't switched it on the CNO, or you have a very long first name and you go by a short form. So it is really important to have that consistency, because you want to have an identity that's searchable. People want to make sure you have a license for good reason. And so that's really important. Are you okay if I go to a couple questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of them was about, and this is anonymous, what is the best way to address career breaks of, say, 6 months? Like one just needed a mental break. And I think this is something that a lot of nurses have gone through over the past 2+ years. So going back to what you had said, right? Like being able to just explain what this gap was without giving too much personal information away. So maybe it was for personal reasons or medical reasons, that type of thing. What do you think?
And it's okay too, like COVID-19 has not been easy on all of us. Everybody has kind of been in the front lines, even to a certain extent, the recruiters have been experiencing the COVID-19 burnouts, right? So it's just really, really important to address that with the managers, because they're not going to hold that against you. They've been in the same boat that all of the nurses have been as well, right? So if you're just upfront and honest with your hiring manager, it's like, hey, I just really needed that 6-month break because the last 2 years were tough. It's not something that necessarily anybody had expected that would be coming up, right? So once you're in that interview, and if that does pop up, just say to the hiring managers, just be like, hey, look, like I was working 80, 90 hours a week. We were, I just got a negative test and I had to go right back, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to kind of necessarily go into specifics, but if that's the case, it's just like, hey, I just needed a quick reset, right? As long as your skills and your everything like that is still there, like that's all that the hiring managers are going to kind of look at, and sometimes that's just what you need.
Yeah, that's good. I like that terminology. I needed a quick reset because that is what a lot of us need right now. Okay, I'm going to put another question here onto the screen. So Marie was just asking, she's using a reverse chronological form on her resume. I'm seeing conflicting messages when I'm doing some research. So my understanding is that hiring managers always want to see reverse chronological order. Is that what you prefer, Adam?
Yeah, that's pretty much the best practice that we've done, because as busy as the recruiters and human resources is, the managers and the directors are even busier, right? So saving the amount of time, just kind of having everything that's most applicable up front really kind of does wonders for your applications, just because everything's going to be clear, it's going to be concise, and they don't need to go through 5 or 10 pages of a resume to kind of get to the information that they're looking for. So that's something that hiring managers do appreciate.
Okay, so I was thinking we could take two more questions and then we'll end because we're coming up to our hour. So this one is from Wendy. She's saying, can we talk about job searching for positions beyond registered nurse, public health, nurse educator, etc.? I find that there are a large variety of jobs out there. So it sounds like, Wendy, you're looking for some non-traditional jobs in nursing. And I would say LinkedIn is a really good place to find them. I actually run a Facebook group for remote nursing jobs in Canada, if that's something you're interested in. So you can just go to Facebook and look up Remote Nursing Jobs Canada, and I post as many remote jobs as I can find. But in terms of other non-traditional type jobs, I think it's just getting onto LinkedIn and finding companies that do hire nurses for non-traditional jobs. So that might be something like a medical device rep, or maybe working for a pharmaceutical company. Working in sales even. So it really depends on what you're looking for. And if you even start to look around, other nurses on LinkedIn and seeing what kind of non-traditional jobs they have and what it took for them to get there, that might be another thing to do. Like, I think LinkedIn is really good for networking. Don't be afraid to send a message to someone and say, hey, do you mind if we have a quick chat one day about how you got to where you are? And that might be a way to kind of figure out what your next step should be. So those are some suggestions. In addition to LinkedIn, I know you can find quite a few non-traditional jobs on Indeed as well. So Adam, if you have any suggestions, I think we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, and just the biggest thing too, like for my organization, there's a lot of different areas where you can switch into, right? So really just kind of narrowing down what you're truly looking for, that's going to help you really solidify your job search and keep it shorter too. A lot of the times for organizations too, depending on where you are, some of the positions that are in my organization were created just by an idea and a business case study. So if there's a position that you think your organization is necessarily lacking, or if there's something that you've heard of before, it's just like, hey, why don't we have this position? It wouldn't hurt to bring that to your current organization as well. It's like, hey, I've identified this gap. Here's this position that I'm considering. What do you think about this one? So there's those options as well that you can do in your organization.
Uh-huh. There was one person who said that many years ago, when she made her email address, she couldn't get any version of her name. I'm recently retired and looking for a casual position. Would a unique email address be a problem? So my suggestion for most of my clients is actually to get a Gmail address, because there is sometimes bias towards anybody that has email addresses such as Hotmail or Yahoo. It might indicate that you're of a certain age or you're not good with computers. So if you wanted to think about getting a Gmail account, I'm assuming you don't have a Gmail account, but that might be something to consider, where you can get some version of your first and last name. So I think that would be something I would suggest. And I'm just going to throw one last question here. This person is wondering about a cover letter or email. Is that not current practice? Okay, I want to know, Adam, what you think about cover letters, because I get this question all the time, and I would love to know your opinion.
Yeah, so cover letters, they don't necessarily apply because a lot of the times they're improperly written. So your resume will really do the talking. So it's really important that you do get somebody to review your resume, like somebody with Sara services, and just kind of make sure that you're kind of hitting the nail on the head, right? Because a lot of the time it's just like, well, I'm this, this, and this, and I'm a nurse, right? So it's you really, if you are going to do a cover letter, you're going to really make sure that you nail the what's the word I'm looking for?
Hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, that's it. So you just really want to make sure that you really have a cover letter that's out of the park, because half the time I'm going to skip over and I'm going to go straight for the resume, because when you get submitted for a position, that's what we call in the recruitment world. I'm going to send a little bit of a blurb as to why this person should be hired, right? So I'm going to say Sara has 10 plus years of nursing experience. She's worked in labor and delivery. She's had these certifications. Please let me know if you'd like to meet with this person. So most of the recruiters do that job for you. So the cover letter is just kind of, it is slightly outdated unless you kind of got a all-star cover letter.
Yeah. I tell people all the time, a cover letter is not meant to repeat what's already in the resume, because then there's no point to the cover letter. So I don't know if there are particular reasons why you'd want to have one, like if you've had a career gap, or maybe you've had a large number of different jobs. Would that be a reason to have a cover letter, or do you think it's still not necessary?
Still not necessary. It's something that's addressing a problem that you may not necessarily, if you address it the wrong way, it could turn hiring managers away.
Okay.
So your resume should do the talking for you. And then if the recruiter is going to say, hey, what happened from 2002 to 2010? Then that's when you can have that conversation. Sometimes people are hesitant, but recruiters aren't scary, right? Not all recruiters are bad. There are some bad recruiters that give us a bad name, right? But it's really about building that relationship with the recruiter, because you never want to kind of decline a recruiter's message, because you never know what position that they have. So like if I don't have a position that you're looking for now in 6 months, you may have a position for them in 12 months from now, right? So it's really important to have that open communication with the recruiter, build that relationship, because there's still some nurses that I've had a relationship with for 5+ years, just because of the way that, I've interacted with them, and vice versa.
Amazing. So I think we'll end now because our hour is getting close to being up. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming on with me. Do you want to share your contact info with people so they can find you if they have more questions?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I will pop it in the chat. If you guys are interested in any opportunities that Westpark currently has, or if you're just kind of curious about any options that we're having in the future, because we are going to have a new smart hospital being built in 2023. So there's going to be a lot of new opportunities that I don't even know about just yet. So there's going to be a lot of new and exciting opportunities upcoming. So I will pop that in the chat. I don't know why I don't have.
I don't have access to the chat, so this is something I got to figure out for next time. But if you want to just tell people how to find you, or maybe they can just
on LinkedIn,
send you a message on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn's fine. Some of you may have actually seen me add some of you to my network. I'm going to be continuing to do that as well, so then that way we could keep in touch for anything that's inspiring, or even just to grow with the network. It's always good to have those connections on LinkedIn.
Yeah, and if anyone listening wants to reach out to me, send me a message on LinkedIn, or if you don't have access to sending messages, just send me a connection request and I'll be happy to add you back. So if you do want to learn more about me or my services, you can go to thernresume.com, all one word. You can send me a message through my page, which is the RN Resume. You can email me at thernresume@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening. I will try to figure out how to put this on my YouTube channel as well, and I'll put up a post about that.